an opportunity for them to be able to view this. And then if anyone wants to take this and share this with perhaps their board or anyone else that may be interested in it, friends, family, children, I don't know, you can do so later. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Chris Hyde. I'm the Board Development Advisor with the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues. Why am I doing this? So this is a two-part piece I thought I would put forward on to sort of help with and give some ideas for effective board governance. And I call this one before the board table. And this is really meant to capture what are some things that board members should know. I mean, when you become a board member, is that there's not always a great training manual on what it means to be a good board member. A lot of times you can learn about your policies, bylaws for your organization, but you don't always get to know, what are some of the things you should keep in mind when you become a board member and how you can be a more effective board member. So it's by no means comprehensive, but I've tried to sort of put together a list of things that I think that every board member should know. Just a bit about my background. I've done governance training for a number of organizations, both here in Ontario, where I'm from. I was chair of the board for two hospital-affiliated community boards, one not-for-profit and one for-profit. I was chair of the board for an early years center, and I served in a board capacity on several of the universities back in Ontario, where I'm from. If anyone's comfortable and is able to, maybe take a second and just introduce yourself, just so I know who's here and maybe what community league you're from. Marissa, I know you're both with us and with North Glenora, so that's good. But if anyone wants to go next and do a brief introduction, just name where you're from, that would be just great.
So my name's Jennifer. I'm from Carnarvon Community League up in the Northwest. I'm the president there. I've been president for about a year, and I never actually know if I'm running the meetings properly. I especially don't know how to stop people from running on. So I'm looking forward to any tips and tricks that you can provide. Thanks, Chris.
Yep, wonderful. And I'll just add on that note, and thanks to that, Maria. I'll just add on that note, Jennifer, is that there's one next week as well. I don't know if you can't attend it. I can still make it available. Where it's sort of the at the board table stuff, which I think might be really interesting on sort of how to set and follow your agenda, cut folks off, when to do things like that. A little bit about Robert's rules and why I both love and hate it. And so, yeah, talk about that. Just sort of to kick it off. There's the screen should have moved. There we go. One of the things I like to always talk about is just my overall description. What is the board? It's the highest authority of the community league. I just like to remember that is to let all board members know that when they join the community league board is that they are the ultimate decision makers and they're responsible for the stewardship of the league. And one of the lessons that I think is important to instill in any board member for community league is that you are the steward. If you've been there for 5 months or 15 years, you're the stewards. So your responsibility is to make sure that the league is in the same or better position than it was when you got there, but you are definitely not the long-term owners of it. And sometimes that lesson, I mean, when we've all been on community leagues for a long time, we tend to sort of view it as, as kin. It's something that we're very proud of and is important to us. But I just like to remind community leagues members, board members in that case, is that they are the stewards of the league, and that eventually their time will be gone, they'll be off, and somebody else will be in charge. And so their responsibility is to make sure it's in the same or better spot than it was when they got there. They're the highest decision-making body. All decisions ultimately come and reflect upon the board, whether it's a decision they've made or whether it's something that they've delegated authority, so they are responsible. They're the ultimate sign-off on all financial matters. And ultimately, they're the ones that are accountable for the entire organization to the membership. What does the board do? And this I just like to sort of provide just that general basic overview. They approve the budget and provide financial oversight. They monitor executive and operational performance, and they operate according to organizational governance policies. That's sort of the basic stuff when you look at what the board does. They look at ways that the organization is performing, handing out tasks. Community leagues, there's a touch of difference in there, and I'll sort of get into it a bit later on as well. Is that community league board members wear 3 hats. And so it's a couple times when I've had conversations like this, they say, well, no, as the board member, I open the rink or I work on the facilities. And I'll say, no, actually you don't. Your hat from the board perspective is based on governance. And so you're looking at a lot of these higher level functions for the organization. You may manage, a treasurer will manage the books of the organization. You may open up the rink and wear that hat for the facilities. But at the same point in time, if you're as the board member, you have that very specific governance task. What are some of the advanced things that boards do that I think is important? They connect with members to understand what they want and need. They drive the organization to achieve those objectives that the members want and need. They plan the strategic direction of the organization. They evaluate progress against the plan, and they act with one voice and fulfill one mandate. Again, that's some basic and advanced concept for what it means to operate as a board. A lot of times, and some of the challenges that community league members have when they come on boards is they think that the job of the board from year to year is to open the rink, have the soccer, maybe open the doors in the community league, and then to move on. And I often would challenge them and say is that I think what's really critical is that you should always strive to understand the strategic direction of your organization. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later because I think that's an important thing for board members to understand. Here's where I'm going to have my habits of highly effective board members. And this is going to be sort of the meat of what we're going to talk about today. They're going to know the job. They're going to act on behalf of the members. They're going to transition when I press click. There we go. They're going to set targets for the community league and assess performance. They're going to identify risk for the organization. They're going to do recruitment. And it's not just a 12-month word, and I like to say that because I know a lot of times is that not all board members, and for community leagues especially, are aware of the importance of their recruitment. And last, they're going to prepare themselves. And when I say prepare yourself, I mean as a board member, you're going to figure out what you need to do to prepare for your meetings. And that's the purpose of our discussion today, is to talk about all the things to know that are going to before you're going to head into your next meeting. I like to think of this as a way is that this covers two general areas. One, if I'm a new board member, I'm a returning board member in a different role, what do I need to know before I have that first board meeting? And two, let's say I'm between board meetings, how can I best prepare myself for that next meeting? So it sort of takes that higher level one of what you want to do, but it also has sort of the minutia of how to prepare yourself for that next meeting. Next. Click. If I say click, will that work better? Click.
Do you want me to switch the slide, Chris?
Maybe. There we go. Okay. Okay. Know the job. First thing that we'll lay out here. Board member. So know the job. So what does that mean by that? Know two things. Understand board member responsibility and liability. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was just trying to mute myself.
Hey, that's okay. Understand the business of the organization, and then continually orient and educate yourself on those two things. And I think that's pretty critical, and I'm going to get into what those mean. And board member responsibility and liability, whoever made up the terms, I really think they made it so it would sound scary and intimidating. It's not. It really, I think there's some important stuff in there that board members can understand what they're responsible for, and also understand where their liability resides. Can you hear the ice in the background? My wife's getting ice out of the refrigerator right now. All right, and I'm going to the next slide. Am I though? Yes, I am. All right, director liability. Board members have the four principal duties, although I combine the last one and basically into one because they make the same. Duty of loyalty, duty of care, duty of due diligence / obedience. And so duty of due diligence and obedience, they tend to sort of bleed into one another. You'll see some governance trainers and experts will say, well, it's more due diligence. You'll say others who say it's obedience. So I generally combine them, although I do reflect that there was sort of four schools of thought on this. Duty of loyalty, I'm going to get into that right now. So duty of loyalty means the board directors must place the interests of the organization ahead of their own interests at all times. And sometimes that's at conflict with the very reason that people join the board. They publicly disclose any conflict of interest and not use board services means for personal or commercial gain. That'll sort of tie into some good practices I'll touch on in a second. But I think anyone who's served on a board, especially a community league board, has had a question or has been concerned about a potential conflict of interest, either themselves or one of their fellow board members. And so duty of loyalty means is that the person at all times and the board at all times is aware where that conflict of interest may arise, and if they want to make sure that they're not seen as using their position for personal or commercial gain. It also means to maintain solidarity with fellow board directors in decisions undertaken at board meetings. Sometimes for community league, when something comes up at a community league board, it can be contentious. We can come to loggerheads and folks can just not agree. What's really critical is that when that board meeting is closed and that this final decision has been made, is that solidarity is maintained amongst the members of that board. I can think of offhand at least half a dozen times in sort of my governance career where the board has come to a decision that I absolutely did not agree with. Even when I was chair, I just didn't agree with the decision made. But the next day, if we had to go out and speak about it on the news or talk to the media or put something in print, I had to maintain solidarity with that decision that had been made. And that can be a difficult thing at times. But for board members, hey, if your objections are noted in the minutes, if your position is reflected in the minutes, then you've done your responsibility. And then the next job is to go out and to maintain solidarity with decision making by the board. What are some good practices that can sort of help do that? Make sure the board has a really robust conflict of interest policy. One thing I do like to say is that normally, in my role at the EFCL, I have something called Conflict of Interest Friday, because every Friday afternoon at 1 p.m. somebody calls with a conflict of interest question about that's happening at the board level. One of the important things I like to say is that if the board has a good, well-written, well-crafted conflict of interest policy that everyone is aware of, you can protect yourself much better than any discussion at the board table. You should also have governance strategies for calling out conflict of interest. What's the easiest way to do that? I used to set aside 2 minutes at the start of every board meeting where the second item on my agenda was for people to declare a potential conflict of interest, either for themselves or for another member of the board. Sometimes you can just say, I think that Dave and Bonnie, who happen to own the coffee shop upstairs, have a conflict of interest with our discussion on rent. And that's okay to do that. And it's a healthy thing. And it's definitely not something that anyone should feel shame about. You're not calling somebody a bad person or a bad board member. You're merely identifying as a board, there's a potential conflict of interest and the whole board could get into trouble on this. So I think it's a really good idea to have those strategies for calling out conflict of interest. And then you have those declarations which can support that. Next, I'll click down, or Jenny will, one of us will. Duty of care. So duty of care means board members use their own judgment to participate in decision-making on behalf of the organization. The responsibility for making informed judgment lies with the board member, which means they need to secure facts and ask questions to get the clarity of the issues. And duty of care also means that board members should seek out independent professional advice when decisions relate to buying or selling significant assets or when entering into material contracts. What essentially does that mean? That means is that take your responsibility to make a decision seriously. So when you come to a meeting, come prepared. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on with some of that, but make sure that you have informed judgment for all matters. One of the best things I can say to boards is that, to board members, is that if you don't know, ask to abstain. Because if enough folks feel comfortable abstaining from a board decision, when it occurs at the table, the decision can fail. And it also can flag to the chair or to your president that, hey, you know what? Not enough people know what we're talking about, or not enough people feel comfortable to make a decision on this, so we need to revisit it. So I think the ability to abstain and the ability to state that you can't make an informed judgment is really, really critical. We want board members to come to the table prepared and to be able to make those good decisions, but you know what? We're all busy, and this is a volunteer position. We're all busy and this is a volunteer position. And so there's going to be times when we just can't when things happen in our life that we can't keep up with the information and the decision-making process of the board. That's okay. We're allowed to do that. Just, I would often say, be upfront about it. Seek out independent and professional advice. There's never been shame for a board member to ask for professional advice on a decision. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean that the board as a whole agrees to go and talk to a lawyer about an impending contract. That means if an individual board member has concern about a decision that's being made, they, within their capacity, can go out and can seek a second advice. They can seek that advice and share that information with the board. I've seen it done numerous times. I'm not going to lie. The first time somebody did it to me as a chair, when I was chair, and somebody said I went out and talked to a lawyer, and this is what they said, I was caught off guard. And to be honest, the insecurity side of things says I feel a little bit dumb for not having done that myself. But the important part is that board, that board member, in order to make an informed judgment, needed that extra advice, and they went out and sought it. And it should be encouraged. At the EFCL, all the time, we see folks coming and reaching out for advice on any number of board matters, independent perhaps of even their own president. That should be encouraged, and we should also be able to provide them with the information they need to make that decision. What are some good practices in there? Policies and procedures for any and all financial matters. So in order for someone to come up with to make a sound judgment, make sure that there are solid procedures for financial expenditures so that a board member can reasonably understand how the money is going to be spent, what it's going to be spent on, what it can be spent on. You can request the timely distribution of all board materials. As a board member, I think it's critically important that you say, I need this information 7 days in advance. Heck, I need it 10 days in advance. I think that's quite okay, because if as a board member, if you receive information in a manner that's not timely, that doesn't help you prepare for the meeting, it's just not useful, right? And so in a way that you're limiting your ability to make that sound judgment. And last, build a good network. So I think I touched upon that before. And I'll move my slide thing. Oh, Jenny, you and I both pressed it, didn't we? We did. Okay, due diligence and obedience. Board members have the responsibility for making sure that organization complies with all federal, provincial, local laws and regulations. It means the board members remain faithful to the board's organization and vision. So, due diligence obedience means you're aware of what's going to impact your organization from a federal, provincial, municipal standpoint, legal standpoint. And it also means that you're going to keep an eye on the organization's vision and mission going forward. So what are you doing? Why do you exist? Where are you going forward? We're going to touch upon that second one a bit later, but just to talk about the due diligence element, some good practices for that are going to be onboarding that includes a breakdown of all applicable laws and regulations. If something applies to your organization, either it be the tripartite agreement, it's the Societies Act, or maybe there's something that impacts some of the service provisions you have, daycare or a yoga studio. Any regulation that is going to impact, the board members should be made aware of when they're onboarded. I would also designate a board member to remain apprised of changes to legislation. Oftentimes, the best can be the secretary, but if a board member has a keen interest in some of these changes, I think it's just great for them to be able to remain involved. You can have regular check-ins on your vision, mission, and values. A lot of times those elements, especially at the board table, are once a year things. We create them, we throw them in a desk drawer, we pull them out once a year and look at them. I think in many ways, keeping them in mind and keeping an eye on them as they inform your business and they inform your regular board meetings is a great thing. Being able to have a board meeting and say, everything we discussed today, none of it applies to our vision or mission. It was ancillary to that. Is something that a board member can say to try and keep themselves on task, and it helps the board focus on those really effective matters. And then you can also have regular discussion on strategic and generative governance matters. I'll touch upon that a little bit later, but essentially what that means is that when we get together at the board table, we don't just talk about financial reports or director reports or how many people skated on the rink that week. It means we talk about those strategic issues, or even better, those generative issues. Generative issues are a little bit more complex, and it's more of the discussion that I have next week, but essentially it's that you ask critical questions about your existence. Board member liability. Oh, here we go, back one, there we go. Board member liability. So, and this is just to make sure everyone's aware of this, whoever is a board member, is a director may be held personally liable for damages arising as a result of various actions or inactions by the director, including act that acted as illegal, permitting the corporation to act outside of its authority, liability for any unpaid employee wages, and failure to remit deductions to the applicable federal and provincial authorities, and misrepresentation. So essentially is that there is a certain level of board indemnity, or indemnification for board members that you're covered, but you can be held personally liable if you do, as a result of your actions or inactions, anything that's going to be illegal or anything that allows you to operate outside of its authority. The simplest way to describe that second one is that if the community league board agrees to open a bar in their community league hall, and then something happens, either somebody gets sick or somebody gets hurt, and that was outside of its authority, that board is going to be personally responsible, and those members are going to be responsible. And there's not going to be any type of indemnification that's going to protect them, compared to, say, somebody breaks their leg running on the soccer field or breaks their leg playing hockey. There's going to be a degree of indemnity there that's going to happen. But this is where I say this is the good part. You start with the scary stuff and you go with the good part, is that most boards indemnify current and former directors against liabilities incurred by them acting as a director if they reasonably believe their conduct was lawful. So if the board can say, hey, listen, you know what, I think we're okay here, and I think the way that we're going to proceed meets all those legal standards, odds are you're going to be held blameless. There is no set standard for reasonable. I do make sure I add that part, is that reasonable is an interpretation. By and large, though, if you arrive at a decision that your fellow board members arrive at, that a reasonable person would arrive at, that will probably meet the standards. It does exclude a few things: slander, libel, or illegal personal gains by the directors, losses covered by their insurance, wrongful acts, or intentional dishonest acts. So in that case, we want to be careful. The slander libel thing is, I think, oftentimes can be critically important. We're dealing with neighbors most often. We would hope that our communications and engagement with our neighbors remain positive, but sometimes things can get heated. And sometimes there can be competing factions. For instance, I'll just make something up here, a condo or homeowners association that sort of runs parallel services, where the board may want to say something in a bit of a heated exchange. Slander and libel aren't something that those board members are going to be protected from in that case. So that's just something to remain aware of. Understand the business of the organization. So what does essentially that mean? And this is back to sort of those higher level effective habits. So you understand your community league operations and services, understand your assets and liabilities, understand your key grants, your funding sources. Where can you spend money on? If you're a board member and you don't know what your casino funds can be used for every year, that's not a great thing. You should be able to know what your discretionary and non-discretionary spending can be put on. And I think that's a critical thing, because if not, you're exposing yourself as a board member to that risk. You may allow money to be spent through an action that it wasn't supposed to be. So again, it's that you should be able to really understand what the organization is in. Also understand the key filings and those important dates for the community league. I've interacted with some boards where folks didn't know when the annual filing was due, but they also didn't know when some of the ancillary operating grant information was due to the city, right? And so it's important that everyone at the board level is aware of those key filings and those important dates. I'll talk a little bit later on about a way that can be done pretty quickly and easily. Act on behalf of the members. So again, this is a pretty big one and a pretty important one. So what does it mean to act on behalf of your members? Well, one, you identify your owners, you seek their views and values. You establish the strategic direction of the organization. You identify who the community league serves and why it exists. And I think these are important ones. And I think, if I can be completely fair and blunt, these are not things that community leagues often do. In a lot of cases, and this is not to be pejorative, community leagues, if I was asked somebody in a community league why they exist, they would say because they exist. They would say because it was there before they moved into the community, and it'll be there long after maybe they've gone, which is correct. However, I would also argue is that there needs to be some other questions that board members should ask. Connect with members. The board member has a unique responsibility for creating the organization's future, and the reason you do that is that you're doing it on behalf of the membership that you serve. So part of the critical part of that is you connect with the membership to craft your goals for the future. What do I mean by that? I mean is that as you're engaging in either your long-term planning, your short-term, your annual planning. Heck, if you're planning for an upcoming barbecue, is that you want to do it not because the outcome or the output itself is the goal, but you want to find a goal that benefits that of your members. If there's been a change in demographic or financial circumstances from a majority of your members, you want to craft goals that are going to meet their needs and that's why you should always be aware. Connecting with members can be, for some, is the more difficult part of being a part of a board. Some folks, when they go on a board, they have a very technical skill, and that technical skill is not going out and cold calling or knocking on doors with members of their community or selling memberships door to door. And that's okay. Sorry, that was my youngest. And that's okay to do that. However, I think every member of the board should understand that those linkages formed with the current membership is critical to the future of the organization. And all strategy and planning should be done with members' involvement. Went too far. Establishing the strategic direction of the organization. So it's an important role of the board is to establish identity and strategic identity. The board must identify identity, which consists of vision, mission, and values. Very nice. Vision, mission, and values. They don't have to be called that necessarily. You don't have to have a defined strategic plan that has vision, mission, and values. I prefer it. I think it's highly valuable. But you should know each of those things, what they are, and what they mean to your community league. What is your community league's vision for your community league? A lot of times they'll have the statement to build a thriving and vibrant community for the residents of, let's say, North Glenora, where I live. And that's great. And they'll also have their mission in there, and they'll have some of their values in there. And I think the values is becoming increasingly important for community leagues to understand who they serve and why they serve them. We need to establish a strategic direction, including the clear vision for the community for the future and the organizational goals and strategies, and ensure that their operational policies and plans support the major goals and strategies. So what that means essentially is that have a plan for the future and ensure that the work that you're doing on an annual basis meets that. It doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be overly high level, but if your strategy is to build a more inclusive community and one of your goals to do that is to have soccer registration with fees of, I don't know, $300 a player, you may not be meeting that goal. So make sure that there is some congruence between what you hope to be as an organization and the actual programs and services that you're offering to your community members. Identify who the community league serves and why it exists. One of the things I'd say is that I'm not looking for geographic, it's my phone, I'm not looking for geographic boundaries here. That's not what we're talking about. I want to know, what are the key needs of your community members that you would like to serve? Has your membership changed in the last 10 years? Will it change over the next 10 years? These are the questions that I think we're looking at of why of who you serve. What's gone on in your community league, in your community over the last 10 years, and how has it impacted your membership? Has your membership gone up? Has it gone down? Has your population aged? Do you have more newcomer families in your community? That's all critical information to understand. How will it change over the next 10 years? I mean, nobody actually knows how it's going to change, but it's something to keep in mind. What's the trend? What are we moving towards? We're going to have more young families in the area. We're going to have an older population. What do we need to do to meet and serve that need? Also, getting to the why we exist question, I think occasionally it's a good idea for a board to ask itself, especially a community league board, what would happen if we were no longer here? Have that discussion around the board table, plan it in your mind. Think of something to have, think of a conversation like that to have, because if the answer is people could no longer play soccer, I would probably say that the community league then needs to do some re-envisioning and reimagining of who it is and why it serves. But if the community league can say, you know, there would be a lack of distinct services for members of our population. Okay, that's wonderful. I hope you enjoyed it. And so you ask those questions about what would happen if we were no longer here. What would be the change to the community? What would be the hole? What would be the gap? And if that answer doesn't critically inform your value and what you mean to the community, there may need to be some conversations about what we mean going forward. Set targets and assess performance. And I'll be blunt on this. Nobody likes targets and performance. I used to do performance targets for the federal government in Ottawa, and people really disliked me. And so now my wife says that's a personality thing. I don't agree, but that's fine. So part of it is that you want to set targets for your community league every year. To varying degrees, I think most folks are already doing this. They set some type of performance targets they have for the year, whether they call it that or not. We're going to open the rink as soon as frost comes. And we're going to hold a summer barbecue. So they already do it. And there's plenty of opportunity to create longer term goals or targets. You know, a community league can say, we want to see an exponential increase in the number of folks who are renting the hall for cultural offerings over the next 3 years. And then the community league has an understanding of what they need to do that, of how they're going to reach that. Well, we're going to go out and we're going to talk to newcomer families, or we're going to talk to groups here. We're going to maybe work with some ancillary organizations that operate in our community, right? So I would encourage organizations to think about targets, not just in a sense of that something that needs to be reported on, but to think about something that can be a little bit longer basis, maybe 1 year, maybe 3 years. Think of how those targets can help you meet those strategic goals we talked about earlier. The effective targets are always going to be SMART. So whenever you're setting targets for your community league, they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. You know, the acronym is overused and it's become quite commonplace, but it still makes sense. In order for you to do it, it should be something you can measure. You should be able to track that performance. It should be something you can achieve in 1 to 3 years. They can't be grandiose vision-related tasks. They have to be something that is achievable. They have to be relevant to what you do. I mean, if your goal is not tied to your reason for existing or to any of the majority of the work you're doing, it's not relevant, and it has to be timely. You have to be able to measure it in a timely manner. You should delegate goals and objectives to specific directors and volunteers when the target is created. And so as a board member, if there's a goal, because remember, we wear those different hats, if there's a goal that's created that you have a specific interest in, or that you would like to see managed to the end, I would encourage you to get involved and to try and find a place for you to be involved in that. You don't necessarily have to be involved in the program or service offering, but just find a way to keep track of it, to remain abreast of it. Goals and targets don't have to be intimidating. They're guideposts that the organization can aim for. I know a few community leagues where I talked about some goal setting, and one of the things they were concerned about is always, what if we don't meet it? What if I don't do it? I'll look silly in front of the population. I'll talk about that in a second, but I'll say no, is that they're guideposts. There's something you're aiming for. There's something you're trying to achieve. Assess performance. Again, and so the flip side of that is that I would make reporting on targets a regular part of your board meetings, either through dashboards, through committee reports. If you know, one of the great assets you can have for your board members, if you're the chair, or even, you know, something as who works on a committee, is to have regular dashboarding of how you're doing against your financials or how you're doing against your committee mandate and work plans. You need to report outwards to the community if you feel comfortable. I always add that, because if you have goals, one of the best things you can do is report on them to the community, because it tells the community that as a board member, that you're focused not only on the strategy, but also on the work needed to achieve that strategy. So I think that's really important. So I think having those conversations and setting in place the reporting capacity to report outwards to your community is great. Does it have to be a regular 5-page community report on performance targets and work? No, it doesn't. No, it can be progress on building a new hall that you put up on Facebook. It can be talking about targets for community inclusion events, about how many you've held to date and what the long-term goal is. It can be quite simple, but I think communicating those goals outwardly is really effective. You want to reevaluate those goals periodically. One, it's a great tool for onboarding new board members. When you kick off with new folks on the board, if you can talk about your goals and your progress against them, it's a great way to bring them up to speed. And two, it's a great way when you reevaluate them to have flexibility if you need be. You know, if you talked to somebody had said in late 2019, here's our goals, and then suddenly by April 2020, because of the pandemic, all of it is off the table, well, you need to evaluate. You need to reevaluate that. You need to have those discussions. Circumstances don't have to be something as dire as a pandemic. They can be a change in municipal funding. They can be a change in development. They can be impacts of road closures from city construction. They can be a lot of things that are going to impact it. But just make sure you reevaluate to account for them going forward. What can you measure that performance against? Past performance or other community leagues or organizations is probably the easiest way to do it. How do you compare against 2 years ago? How do you compare against 5 years ago? How do you compare against a neighboring league? It doesn't have to be competition. You're just understanding how performance relates to other community leagues. If you want to keep that internal, because those comparisons sometimes can be a bit hot button, that's okay as well. Another part of performance that I think is important is develop a fair and formal complaints process for your members to be able to provide feedback on your performance. I think if you allow community members the capacity to complain, to talk about their experience with the community league board, it's an important thing. It's a really important part. And as a board member, if you're comfortable with that information, you can take action upon it. So then when we hear about maybe disgruntled community members who are very passionate about certain things, you might not hear from it only at the AGM. It might not rear its head once a year. You might actually get those complaints and that impact on those statements on performance throughout the year. So you can take steps to modify. You can take steps to help them reach their goals. You can take steps to adjust your work plan and make sure they're needed. Sometimes you're going to just hear complaints from folks. And as a board member, we have to be comfortable with listening to that and understanding if that's credible and how, if any change to performance is going to be needed to mitigate that going forward. Some things you could monitor, just as an example. I just threw a couple of these up because a lot of times when folks will say, well, I don't know goals, I've never worked with them, I don't have any experience with them. Well, here's some things. You can monitor your finances. You can look at your financial expenditures, monthly, quarterly. You can look at your service results. You can look at compliance with board organizational policies. That one's a little dry, but it is definitely something worthwhile. You can look at human resources, like you can track your board and volunteer retention, your training, your recruitment. What's your standard that you're setting for volunteers? Are you meeting that? If not, why? Right? Because the whole process of the performance is that it's not to punish yourself, and it's not to be critical. It's to say we've set volunteer standards of 50 volunteers a year. We've reached 30 and 35 respectively over the last 2 years. What do we need to do? What do we need to adjust? Again, a lot of our community leagues are probably doing this already. And so this is just a way of building upon that. You can do member surveys. Be cautious with survey fatigue. It is real, and especially now that everyone's digital and everyone's online in these services. But I think, again, now and then it's critical to ask questions about member satisfaction. The membership drive annually is a great time to do it. You can do surveys on media reports. Again, how often is the community league being discussed in the media, in the local media? Ideally, it should probably be pretty low, because normally when the media reports on a community league, it's not a good thing, but that's beside the point. And then board performance. You can just have board evaluation surveys that can be used in there. Identify risk, and risk is sort of, again, one of those scary things, but I say it's something that's really, really, really critical for board members to keep in mind. Risk management is forward-looking for community league boards. So they need to ensure that community league has adequate resources to conduct its affairs safely without undue risk to staff, volunteers, and members. So that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we can safely continue to operate and do all the things that we do, and that could be owning a hall, it could be opening up a rink, that could be soccer, it could be lots of stuff without undue risk to everyone involved. Is there a hole in the roof, or is the roof falling apart? Something we need to be aware of. Maybe we can't hold events in the hall that year. Review board and governance policies and bylaws periodically, and monitor practice to ensure compliance with the above. One of the things that I'm often surprised at when I engage with community league boards is how many board members may not be aware of their own governance policies or bylaws. There's been times frequently when I've talked with folks and they're not aware of what's in their bylaw manual. And so I think it's of critical importance that the board members be aware of it, and that these things are reviewed for them periodically. You don't have to open up the whole bylaw manual once a year. You can talk about snippets throughout the year. You can have a governance committee who brings it up for review. There's lots of mechanisms that we can do to make sure that the board is remaining apprised of that information. You can follow the generally accepted accounting standards for keeping your financial records. Jenny and I can both name off the top of our hat several leagues that we've worked with where they were not following generally accepted accounting standards for their financial records. And so when there was a transition, or when something went wrong financially, there were some challenges in coming up with that information. So again, part of board risk is making sure that there are standards in those financial records. For a lot of community leagues, they're doing that. I would guarantee that most community leagues have great treasurers who are keeping an eye on their books and have it in such a way that if that treasurer was forced to leave that role, somebody could come in the next day and would understand the financial health of the community league. But not everyone is, and so that's why we say that. Building the requirement for secondary approval for major financial expenditures. We've heard this. We've heard of folks saying is that, hey, listen, the board was able to make, somebody on the board was able to make a spending decision without proper oversight. That didn't have to go to the members. It wasn't included in the budget. And I would often say is that, well, do you have financial policies and procedures that impact this? And they say no. So that's what I would often say is that for an element of risk, make sure that when you're going to have major financial expenditures that aren't covered by the budget, you have a policy that's going to govern it. Has to go back to the board. Has to go back to the general members. I've seen both. Both are really good ideas. And develop a risk assessment program for programs and facilities. Risk assessments don't have to be complicated or scary. It can literally be is that, you know, what's the likelihood of this occurring and what's going to be the impact of this occurring, right? The roof falls in on somebody. Well, the likelihood is sort of medium rare because the roof's in bad shape. What's the risk? Well, the risk is terrible. There could be loss of life. Directors can be sued, loss of public respect, things like that. So again, develop a risk assessment program. We've actually started working on one internally to help share with community leagues. And so that may be something that's available down the road. Recruitment. Oh boy, recruitment. Okay, and so this is, and I see Jenny smiling because this has always been my bone of contention, is that recruitment, board members should build an element of recruitment into all of their duties. And I know that may sound a bit, odd, but what I mean by that is that board members will often wear a lot of different hats throughout the community league, and they should always keep an eye on recruitment when they're engaged in all of those tasks. It cannot just be the responsibility of the nominating committee prior to the AGM season, or it can't be the responsibility of the executive prior to the AGM season. Recruitment should not occur in the 2 to 3 months prior to your annual general meeting because you need to fill a hole. Recruitment should be a dedicated, purposeful act that board members engage in throughout the year when they see somebody who would be of benefit or would have a valuable contribution to their board. That's it in a nutshell. When you're working with folks in the community, when you're selling memberships, when you're out coaching soccer, if there's somebody that comes across as they would be a great asset to the board, keep that in mind. Share that name going forward. Keep that person in mind. That's it. It doesn't have to be overly complex. You identify dynamic community members when you encounter them. Set aside a month of time to discuss one person that you encountered who would make a great addition to your team. I started doing this. I was on a board for a cancer support center in Ontario, and perennially, every year when somebody would leave, it would be a mad dash to find a replacement. And we used to do the doctor, lawyer, accountant thing. And then we just started saying, well, why don't we look for someone who would make a valuable contribution to the board and is knowledgeable with the community of service that we apply to. And then we started setting aside a monthly time where the homework for the board was somebody needs to bring a name. We need to have one name for us to come forward to discuss about this person for a potential board member down the road. That happened throughout the year, happened every month. So by the time that our AGM season rolled around with, on a good year, we would have 9 or 10 folks in line to come on the board. Not all of them agreed, not all of them wanted to do, not all of them had the time, and of course their capacity changed throughout the year. But at least we had a catalog of folks who had an interest in what we did and would make a great asset to it. And I think that's critical, because if that doesn't happen, then what we normally see is we see what I call community of replication, where we have our networks, we get our friends to come and join the board, they get friends who we both know, and so you have very similar groups joining the boarding community in perpetuity, and you may not be reaching and serving, or you may not be building a board that's reflective of your entire community. Open meetings to the membership, let them participate and develop a good understanding of what the board does. Not every board's going to do this, I freely admit that. But if you can open your board meetings to your membership and encourage them to come, you will have an idea of folks who are interested and engaged in what you do. It also allows them to see what goes on at the board meeting. And that doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. They can come and they can say, I noticed at the board meetings, you discuss your reports, you discuss this, but you're not really discussing this issue that's important to me, or this issue that's important to the people that live close to me on my block. That's a great opportunity to say, well, you know what? we would love to have your perspective join us. We think that would be of critical importance. So one of the ways to do that is to open the meetings to the membership or to report back in an open manner. Be open and transparent. Sorry. When folks engage, keep an eye as to whether they would make great board members. And what do I mean by that? Is that mean when people make complaints? When you hear from folks in the community who don't agree with a decision that's been made or don't agree with something that's been happened, always keep in mind not only that this is somebody you have to deal with and that this is a challenging conversation we're having, but in the back of your head, think, would that person make a great board member going forward? Sometimes those things are considered anathematic. Sometimes folks go, I had a very bad experience with somebody who challenged me on a policy issue, ergo, I don't want them on the board. I would argue those aren't the same things. I would argue a challenging conversation about an issue that two parties are passionate about does not immediately mean that both of those parties can't serve on the same organization or board. And that's what I'd say. Understand the salad. So what do I mean by that? So this is what I like to call the board member salad. Understand the board member salad because this is most likely, in my experience, what you're going to get on your board. This is going to be the offerings of folks. They have their own strengths, but they also have some limitations and some concerns. And that not every board member is going to fit these standards that I put out, but I think it's important to understand them. This is about their motivations. So one, you're going to get the mover shaker. That's the individual joining the community league board to enhance their resume or advance their potential political career. Oftentimes they're really dynamic. They have some really good policy ideas, and they may be able to invest a significant amount of time to increase or advance their own reputation. The drawback is they may not be there for a long time. You're going to get the good works. That's an individual that can do good work in their community. Those folks are your lifelong, your steadfast volunteers. They'll often take on multiple roles. They are the bread and butter of community leagues. But in some ways, they're often not interested in governance and other types of board work. So you have to be aware of that. Is that understand what role you want to have from them. Understand what role is going to fit their natural strengths. Don't try and turn a good works into a mover shaker. It's just not going to happen, right? Be aware of it. The agendas. Individuals who join to advance a specific personal or political agenda. Again, these can be very dynamic and are able to exert a ton of effort on a specific issue, usually one that fits their personal or political agenda. However, this individual can also be a disruptive influence. The Keanus, I call them Keanos because it's from whatever that recent movie he did, where they're the reluctant heroes. They will join to fill a hole or serve in a maintenance capacity due to a vacancy or limited community interest. They may have limited capacity or time to contribute. Again, Keanus are valuable because sometimes you just need people to join the board. You need folks who are going to be there so that you can reach quorum, make a decision. I would argue is that if you're engaged in really fruitful recruitment processes, you won't need as many Keanus going forward. You'll let them step back, refresh, recharge, find a time they can come back later, and maybe they become good works. And the shoppers. I love the shoppers because I was one myself. They're new community members. They are eager to participate. They may have unique perspectives or opinions to offer. One of the drawbacks is they might not be completely familiar with the community league and they might not know a lot of folks. But that's not a bad thing. So again, these are some of the folks you're going to see, and these are going to be some of the motivations we're going to have that are going to impact our recruitment going forward. One's not better than the other. None are bad. Just understand that each of them have their own potential strengths and their own potential weaknesses, and find ways that those strengths and weaknesses can contribute to your board or can be managed by your board. Preparing for your upcoming meetings. Well, congrats, folks. We're almost at the end here. And these are sort of my tips and tricks to get us for the meeting. So I've talked about all of those sort of general high-level items that you should have before your board meeting. So that's some of that background knowledge you should possess, and some of the ideas and the foundational stuff. This is really my tips and tricks on preparing for your upcoming meeting. And that's where this comes in. Okay. Help the chair set the agenda. As a board member, one of the best things you can do is help your chair set your agenda on a monthly basis. And if you're a chair, ask for board members to help set the agenda. Open it up. Because if it's one person or if it's just a small portion of the executive who are setting the agenda going forward, there's a greater chance the executive members are going to get burnt out, and there's a greater chance that the board members are going to be disinterested in the process. So make sure that the board has an active role in setting the agenda. Ensure the agenda is board appropriate. If the stuff you're talking about on a monthly basis doesn't fit that governance agenda that we talked about before and doesn't fit your strategy and your vision going forward, it probably shouldn't be there. And if you're filling time, if you're filling space on the board agenda with committee reports that folks just aren't that interested in, again, I would argue that it's not entirely board appropriate. State your prep requirements. So what does that mean? That means is that if you're a board member, be very clear and upfront with how much time you need to prep for your meetings, and be very vocal about your time, the time when it's required. What does that mean? If you have a busy month at work, if you have a busy week at work, it is the responsibility of you as a board member to say to your chair, I need extra days, or I cannot prepare properly for this. That's important. The important element is that the board members come prepared and able to exercise sound judgment. So it's really critical that they're able to say, I'm not going to be able to do that if we bring this agenda out 3 days before. I need a week this time. That's okay. That's an important thing, and that's a good discussion to have. And board members should never, especially volunteer board members, should never feel ashamed for saying they need more time. The chair conversely can say, I don't know if I can get that information out. Maybe we'll table it to a later date. That's okay as well, right? So there's going to be some push and pull here, and I think that's really important. Come prepared. This is the big one. This should be bolded and red and highlighted and all of those things, right? And I get it. And how many times have we all been told to come prepared for meetings? This goes back to being able to exercise that sound judgment. Read the information you need to do it. So there's a second part to it. Be honest about your prep. If you didn't read something, tell your other board members you didn't read it. It's not school where you kind of sit at the back and you're like, oh, I enjoyed the book. The protagonist and the antagonist were awesome, right? It's what we want to do is we want to make sure that you have all the information you need. And if need be, if you don't have the information where you can't make a sound decision, be honest about that. That's one of the most critical things we can do. Prepare together. Share some of the load. If you have big agenda packages, work off a Google Doc. Somebody can develop a summary. It goes back to that honesty thing. If you didn't read it, ask a board member what of the major points were. Ask a fellow board member what some of the critical things you need to read are. Work together on it. It shouldn't be oppositional. It should be working together to prepare yourself for that meeting. Ask for shared resources. One of the things that I've seen community leagues use that are really effective is that their agenda package is come in a multi-use format, i.e. Google Docs, I say it, is that everyone can comment. So community league board members can go in and can throw comments on an agenda package. They can ask questions. It's all there and it's captured. You can see what are some of the things that your fellow board members, what's attracting their attention. It brings it forward in a very common setting that makes it easier to work. I think one of the nicer parts about having to work online in this capacity is that it affords us the opportunity to work together in a collegial manner on these things. Understand your past contributions. Again, as board members, I think it's critical that we know is that what I've done and said in the past. If I've hogged the spotlight, as I was told I often did, at some of my board meetings, it was important for me to be aware of that. It was important for me to be aware when I was drowning out other board members. Conversely, and I think much more importantly, if you're not asking questions at the board table, if you're a silent Sam who sits there and doesn't ask questions and engage with the materials, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why and be prepared to be pushed. And if you're the chair, be prepared to push your board members who don't routinely comment or contribute at the board table. Ask questions early. If you have questions, you get them out as early as you can to the chair or to the rest of your board in writing. Very easy to do. Not all conversations have to happen right around the table. If you ask those questions in advance, sometimes they can move things along and make it easier to manage the meeting. Ask for a consent agenda if it's all possible. Anyone who's not familiar with the consent agenda, those are items that are distributed in advance, like a director report, and it's assumed that everyone has read it. And when it comes time for your meeting, is that the consent agenda items, they're not discussed. It's recognized that they were there, it's recognized they went out to everybody, and it's understood that everyone read it. I think they're really, really valuable tools and they respect people's time. Oh, yes, absolutely, Jen. Sorry, and I'll make sure that's available to you. Divide the agenda into discussion and decision items. Demand more than just reports and updates. If you're a board member, I think it's important that you ask for just financial updates and reports. You want to have better, deeper conversations. Once a month, boards should be having either strategic or generative conversations with their board. Talk about strategy. Talk about those generative questions. I think that's of critical importance. Learn to manage your different hats. And this is the last part I would say, is that know when you're reading a board agenda package, when you're preparing, what your governance hat is, what your management hat is, what your operational hat is. Know where they exist, and that's going to be of critical importance as you're getting ready to engage at the board table. And ask for a board work plan. Clearly define what the board's going to do throughout the year, and have that built in advance. So you know what the expectations of the board are vis-a-vis the workflow, and you know what the outcomes are going to be far in advance if possible. And if you don't have one, see what you can do to help build one, because I think they're invaluable tools. And that's it. How am I for time? Oh, 3 minutes over. I rehearsed it, so, and I was like within seconds. All right. Anyways, everyone who came and joined, I'll take questions. I know some of us probably have to run because lunches are done and we have additional meetings. But before I go, does anyone have any questions or